He thought he found a survivor, but what he touched was the key to humanity's extinction. On the ashes of a dead war, a lone human soldier stumbles upon a wounded alien woman, beautiful, strange, and barely breathing. But as he tries to save her, something ancient stirs in the shadows, watching, waiting. And when she opens her eyes, the war isn't over. It's just begun. The sky was bleeding. Crimson light spilled across the fractured earth, like a memory too painful to forget, molten, angry, and slow. The battlefield was silent now, not because the war had ended, but because there was no one left to scream. Charred wreckage stretched out like the bones of dead titans, blackened husks of ships half buried in crimson dust. Twisted metal, fractured armor, burnt-out mechs, monuments to a fight that no one truly won. Min moved through it like a ghost. His boots crunched softly over broken glass and brittle shell casings. The edges of his armor were cracked and blistered from heat, smeared with a mix of blood and sand that no longer felt like his own. The rifle in his hand hung low, not in defeat, but in quiet surrender. There was no enemy left to kill, and maybe that's what hurt most. His breathing was shallow, controlled. Every step felt like moving through the last pages of someone else's story, one where his name had already been forgotten. Then a sound cut through the stillness. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a failing engine or collapsing steel. It was something alive. A low, raw sound, half moan, half snarl. Not human, but not fully beast. It echoed from beneath a jagged slab of ruined hull plating just ahead. Min froze. His eyes narrowed. And in that instant, hope became something dangerous. Min approached slowly. The metal groaned beneath his boots as he stepped over scorched panels and twisted beams, his hand tightening around the grip of his sidearm, just in case. The sound had come from hair beneath a warped segment of starship hull, still radiating faint heat. Then he saw her. Curled against the body of a dying creature, she looked almost misplaced, as if she had no business surviving the slaughter, and yet somehow had. Her skin shimmered with an unnatural luster-like frost under moonlight, torn in places where her armor had ruptured. Blood, or something that looked like it, trickled from a wound along her ribs, dark and slow. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Violet and wild, yet lucid-like, something caught halfway between predator and prayer. They locked with his, unblinking, defiant, even in weakness. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Behind her, the creature stirred. Massive, reptilian, armor-scaled. It dragged in a breath like a mountain collapsing in on itself. One eye still open, still watching Min. Not aggressive, not anymore. Protective. Min dropped to one knee. He set his weapon aside. No sudden movements, just the slow, deliberate reach for the medical kit strapped to his thigh. Her breathing was shallow, broken by tremors. One of her hands twitched, gripping the creature's hide. She looked like a warrior who had outlived her purpose and was too tired to ask why. "You're not gonna die here," Min muttered, more to himself than to her. The wind picked up, scattering ash in swirls around them. Above, the red sky darkened further, as if the planet itself was mourning. He began to work clearing the wound, sealing what he could with biofoam, trying not to flinch every time she winced or gasped. She didn't cry out. Not once. And when the creature exhaled for the final time, its body slumping beside her in silence, her hand didn't let go. Min looked at her, really looked at her. This wasn't a soldier. Not anymore. This was something else. Something he couldn't explain. And something he wasn't ready to walk away from. They found shelter beneath the skeleton of a wrecked transport, its hull cracked open like a rib cage. Wind howled through the broken fuselage, low and mournful, carrying with it the scent of plasma burn and old blood. Min had cleared a space, dragging insulation and scorched plating into a makeshift wall to block the chill. He worked in silence. His fingers were numb from hours of exposure, but his focus never drifted from her. She lay wrapped in what remained of her cloak, breathing shallowly. The biofoam had sealed the worst of the damage, but her body trembled with each exhale, fragile, exhausted. For a while, he just watched her. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the strange beauty of her features, alien but unmistakably expressive. Maybe it was the flicker of strength she showed, even half dead and bleeding. Or maybe it was because, in a world that had burned to ash, she was the first thing he'd seen that still looked alive. When her eyes opened again, they were softer. Not wild now, just tired. "Still here," he said gently, offering a dry piece of ration bar. She looked at it, then at him, her expression unreadable. "Why?" The word came out broken, like she hadn't used her voice in days. Min didn't answer right away. He knelt beside her, adjusted the wrap on her shoulder. "Because if someone doesn't care, then what's the point of surviving?" She blinked slowly. Then, almost hesitantly, she reached out and touched the side of his neck. Her fingers were cold, her skin like metal kissed by moonlight. He froze. Her touch wasn't searching, it was grounding, like she was making sure he was real. And when she pulled her hand away, something flickered behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe even fear. He leaned back slightly, unsure of the moment, unsure of himself. But she caught his hand. Her voice was little more than breath. "You're warm." The words weren't romantic, they weren't seductive. But they were real. And in a place where everything else had crumbled, reality was a gift neither of them could afford to ignore. He didn't say anything after that. He simply moved closer, laying down beside her, his back pressed against the cold wall of the fuselage. She shifted to barely just enough that their shoulders touched. No words. No promises. Just breath shared in the dark, two hearts trying to remember what it meant to feel safe. And somewhere between the silence and the storm outside, she finally slept. The kind of sleep that only comes when someone chooses to stay. The storm came without warning. A silent flash of white on the horizon, then the low growl of thunder rumbling across the dead plains. Rain began to fall, not water, but something colder, acidic enough to sting. Min had seen what it did to exposed skin. He moved quickly, dragging what he could over the makeshift entrance. A slab of scorched plating, a panel from a ruined shuttle door, anything to keep the wind and chemical burn outside. Inside, the cold was creeping in faster than he could fight it. Lyra was shaking again, her breathing uneven, lips tinted with blue. The cloak wrapped around her was damp, no useless. Her body curled tight, but not tight enough to stop the shivers. Min cursed under his breath. He knew what needed to be done. He didn't hesitate. He peeled off his outer layers vest, undershirt the skin immediately chilled by the stagnant air. Then, carefully, he slipped under the blanket with her. She stirred, eyes fluttering open. No fear, just confusion. "You'll freeze," he murmured. "So will you," she whispered back, her voice cracking like broken glass. "Not if we share it." The space between them disappeared. Skin to skin, heartbeat to heartbeat, her body was colder than he expected, her breath uneven, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her forehead against his chest, listening. One beat, then another. And then she exhaled, slow, deeper than before. The tension began to melt, drop by drop, like frost touched by flame. Her fingers brushed his side, searching for warmth, not desire. Instinct, survival. But something shifted, not in their bodies in the silence. The way she moved her hand, the way her hips adjusted against his, the way her breath lingered just a moment too long on his skin. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't even conscious. It was something older. He looked down and she looked up. And in that fragile, flickering second, there were no uniforms, no languages, no sides in a war. Just the realization that they were alive and lonely and human in all the ways that mattered. When her lips touched his, it wasn't a kiss. Not at first, it was a question. Do I still belong to myself? And when he kissed her back, it was an answer. You do now. They moved carefully, tentative, trembling, like learning to breathe all over again. Clothes were pushed aside, not torn. Touches were soft, reverent, no urgency, just the quiet ache of two souls brushing up against each other through the wreckage of everything they'd lost. Outside, the storm screamed. But in that shelter of steel and breath and warmth, two beings from two dying worlds found a reason not to give up. Not yet. Morning came in shades of rust. The sky outside was a pale smear of ash and light, seeping in through cracks in the hull like the world had forgotten how to shine. The rain had stopped, but the silence that followed was heavier, somehow thicker. Min stirred first. His back ached from the hard floor, his skin still chilled from the storm, but his eyes went straight to her. Lyra was still asleep, or pretending to be. Her body curled toward him, lips parted just slightly, a strand of silver hair stuck to her cheek. For a moment, she looked utterly peaceful, innocent even. And that was the first sign something was wrong. Min reached for his pack. Quietly, slowly, his fingers brushed the scanner embedded into the side of his medkit, the one he'd used 1,000 times on the field, more out of habit than doubt. He hovered it over her abdomen. No alarms, no red flags. But then the scanner flickered. A stutter. A burst of data. Not normal. Not random. A code. He adjusted the settings. Recalibrated. Scanned again. The device flashed once, then pulled up a string of biosignatures that made no sense. Her DNA partly human, but overlaid with synthetic markers. Insertions. Controlled mutations. Min stared at the readout. He blinked. Looked again. This wasn't just an alien. She had been built. He felt something inside him begin to unravel. Lyra's eyes opened. Slowly, carefully, but not like someone waking, more like someone watching through a mirror. Min didn't speak. Not yet. She sat up, the blanket sliding down her shoulder. She looked at him calm, unreadable. "What did you find?" she asked softly. Min's voice was low. "Tell me who you are." Her eyes didn't flinch. "I don't know." He held up the scanner. It hummed between them like a judgment. "This says otherwise." A beat of silence. Then, something flickered across her face, not guilt. Not fear, grief. "There are gaps," she said quietly. "Holes in the memories. I dream of things that never happen. Places I've never seen. Names that don't belong to me." Min felt his jaw tighten. "You were made for this, weren't you? Inserted, embedded. You were meant to find someone like me and, what? Gather intel? Manipulate trust?" She looked away. Her voice was barely audible. "I don't know if the love was real, but the pain is." Min stood, pacing back into the shadows. He needed air, but there was none left that didn't taste like betrayal. She rose to her knees, slowly, hand clutching the edge of a broken strut. "They made me feel it, all of it. I didn't fake it, Min. I couldn't." His hand twitched near his sidearm, then froze. She saw it. Didn't move. Didn't run. "If I was made to destroy you," she whispered, "then why do I feel like dying every time you look at me like that?" He didn't answer. Because in that moment, he wasn't sure what terrified him more. That she was lying, or that she was telling the truth. The alarms came first. Low at first, distant then rising like a chorus of rage. Sirens, tactical pulses. The kind you don't hear unless someone high up believes you've made a mistake that can't be unmade. Min's comm unit crackled to life. His name barked through the static. "Min, report. Are you in contact with alien code, sign Echo 7? Stand down and prepare for retrieval." He didn't respond. Outside the wreck, boots hit the ground. Dozens. Coordinated. Heavy. They'd found him. No more hiding. No more time. Lyra stood barefoot on the cold metal floor, her cloak barely covering her frame, eyes wide but steady. She didn't move toward him. She didn't beg. "You should go," she said. "Alone? You have to survive this." Min stared at her. He could feel the weight of every decision grinding against his chest, every scar, every grave left behind. And in front of him was a weapon made to look like love, but also a woman who bled for him, who cried for him, who may have been made for betrayal, but learned tenderness anyway. His fingers curled into fists. "I'm not leaving you." He grabbed his gear, slung his rifle, and opened the hatch. Light sliced through the rust-dark space. Figures approached armed, no hesitation in their movements. Min stepped out, hands raised halfway, enough to buy seconds. Seconds were all he needed. "Drop the weapon," a voice barked. "You're harboring a hostile." Min didn't answer. Behind him, Lyra emerged from the shadow, her silhouette fragile in the sun's cruel glare. "They're not going to talk," she said softly. "They're going to shoot." Min nodded once, then moved. A smoke canister clattered to the ground, one of his last. In an instant, the world vanished in a cloud of gray and static. Shots rang out wild, uncertain. Min grabbed Lyra's hand and ran. They weaved through twisted steel, smoke curling around their legs like ghosts. Her breath was ragged, but she kept up. She didn't ask questions, didn't stumble. This wasn't her first escape. Behind them, shouting. Closer now. Min ducked behind a collapsed solar panel, pulled her down with him. We won't outrun them. Lyra looked at him, then reached under her cloak. From a hidden pouch, she pulled a device smooth, obsidian black, pulsing with faint blue veins. I wasn't just sent here to learn, she whispered. I was sent to bring something back. Min frowned. What is that? She hesitated. It's a tether. To the network that made me. Min stared at her. So use it. Get out. Her eyes welled up. Not with fear. With something far worse certainty. If I activate this, they'll find me. They'll find us. And everything we've done, everything I've felt it, won't matter. I'll be overwritten. I won't be me anymore. The shouting got closer. Min's voice cracked. Then destroy it. She shook her head. I can't. It's tied to me, built in. Min looked at her, really looked, and saw, not a spy, not an alien, just a woman who'd been made into a weapon and was terrified of being one again. He took the device from her hand, held it like a burning coal, then crushed it against the steel. Sparks. Smoke. A high-pitched whine that made them both wince. Now we run, he said. But the sky above them was already changing. A ripple of light, a fracture forming in the atmosphere. Not soldiers, not humans. Something else was coming. They didn't stop running until the sky fell silent again. A hidden bunker half buried under layers of blackened sand and rusted debris offered them momentary shelter. It was ancient, pre-war tech, obsolete to most. But Min knew how to make ghosts live again. The console hummed under his touch, flickering back to life like an old memory resisting the dark. Lights blinked, a terminal activated. The med scanner came online. Lyra sat beside him, her body bruised, her breath ragged, but her eyes alert. Watching him, watching herself reflected in the cold steel. You want to know what I am, she said softly. He didn't answer. Instead, he placed her hand into the scanner's cradle. The device chirped, then began its analysis flesh, bone, blood, everything beneath. Min watched the readout scroll across the display. Base sequences, neural architecture. Then the anomaly. A mirrored strand 2 spirals. Human and not. Woven together with mathematical precision. Synthetic junctions spliced between them like surgical bridges. She wasn't born, she wasn't grown. She was designed. Min stared at the screen, lips parted but speechless. They built me from a template, Lyra whispered. Part human, part something older, something they never understood. Min turned to her, slowly. Why? Her eyes shimmered not from tears, but from something deeper. Regret, or maybe memory. They thought if they could mix what made your kind, resilient with what made theirs dominant, they could engineer a new threshold. A being that could survive war, but still feel. She looked at her hands. I was supposed to infiltrate, adapt, become close, blend into your species and report how best to tear it apart. Min swallowed hard. And did you? She didn't blink. I tried. Her voice broke slightly. But then I bled, and broke, and felt things I wasn't programmed to understand, like warmth, guilt, love. The screen beeped. Final diagnosis, unknown class, cross-genetic fusion, neural independence detected. Min leaned against the terminal, hands pressed to the cold surface. So you're not fully them, and you're not fully us. She nodded. I am the first mistake they couldn't control. A long silence settled between them. Not empty but heavy. What happens now? She asked. Min looked at her, really looked. And for the first time, he didn't see a weapon. He saw a mirror. They came at dusk. Not the human scouts. The others. The air shimmered before they appeared. Not cloaked, not invisible. Just folded, like reality bent to make room for them. 5 figures, tall, elegant, wrapped in armor, that pulsed with a dull inner glow, cold and old, like ancient gods who had long since stopped caring about the prayers beneath them. Lyra stepped forward before Min could react, her expression unreadable, her shoulders drawn back, but her fingers clenched just slightly. The one in front taller than the rest, its face hidden behind a smooth obsidian visor, spoke in a voice that echoed in the bones more than the ears. "You have not returned as commanded, Subject 17. Min raised his weapon. Not to soothe wasn't suicidal, but to make a point. She's not your subject anymore. The figures didn't move. They didn't have to. Lyra's breath caught, a twitch in her jaw, something between defiance and dread. I was never meant to return, she said. Incorrect, the voice replied. Your data stream terminated prematurely. Emotional interference exceeded protocol tolerances. Reset is required. Min turned to her, quietly. What does that mean? Lyra didn't look at him. She couldn't. It means they're going to wipe me. Min took a step forward. Over my dead. Yes, the entity interrupted flatly. That is the expected variable. A hum rose in the air, not from weapons, but from within Lyra. Her spine arched slightly, her pupils dilated. Min grabbed her arm. Lyra? She clutched her head, gasping, voice shaking. They're inside, triggering the failsafe. Min didn't think. He moved. A single shot from his rifle struck the being's chest, played harmless, deflected, but it bought him 3 seconds, enough to drag Lyra behind a broken pillar of steel. Don't let them in, he whispered, hands on her cheeks. Stay with me, stay you. Her hands trembled, fingertips glowing faintly now, as if her biology itself was resisting battling commands etched into her at the molecular level. Min, if I change, then I'll change with you. Her breath hitched. You don't understand. I'm not built to survive this. You are. He pulled her into his arms, cradling her like something sacred. You survived me. The light inside her pulsed again, harder this time. Her back arched. The voice of the lead alien boomed across the ruins. Subject compromised. Purge initiated. And then, she screamed. Not in fear, not in agony, but in rebellion. Her body erupted in light, not fire, not energy, something older, like a memory unraveling from the source of her creation. Min held on, even as the ground beneath him quaked, even as the air fractured around her like breaking glass. And when the light dimmed, the 5 beings stood frozen, cracked, splintered, like statues, remembering they were once made of clay. Lyra collapsed against him, breath shallow but real. Her eyes found his clear, violet, wholly her own. I broke the link, she whispered. You broke them. But they both knew it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air itself hadn't decided yet if it could breathe again. Min knelt beside her, still catching his breath. Around them, the 5 beings stood motionless, their armor fractured, their visors dimmed, statues of forgotten intent. But Min knew this wasn't victory. It was a pause, a fragile breath before the next storm. Lyra's body trembled against his. Her systemsif, that's even what they had, burned too bright, too fast. Her pulse was erratic. Her skin, once shimmering with ethereal light, now dulled to a soft gray. You said it's not over, Min whispered. She nodded weakly, barely lifting her head. I destroyed the link, but not the root. There's a relay buried deep somewhere they can't reach from here, but it's still listening, still waiting for my signal. Min stared at her. Then we shut it down. Lyra gave a faint, bitter smile. You don't even know where it is. You do. Her eyes fluttered. In theory, it was only ever a failsafe hidden in a place your kind was never meant to see. He touched her cheek gently. Take me there. She hesitated. You'll die if we're wrong. Then I die knowing I didn't run. She looked at him, really looked. And in that gaze, there wasn't admiration, there wasn't romance. There was something harder, something older. Respect. The kind soldiers rarely give, because it only ever comes when someone chooses death for something more important than living. She reached into her suit and pulled out a shard of translucent alloy glass, like humming faintly. This will guide us, she said, but once we cross the ridge, there's no turning back. Min slung his pack, pulled her to her feet. Her legs buckled, but he caught her, supported her. carried her when he had to. They left the broken sentinels behind, climbed through the shattered hills of glass and ash, under a sky that still hadn't forgiven anything. At the ridge's edge, Lyra stopped. "There," she said, pointing. Far below, carved into the wall of a dead canyon, was something that pulsed barely visible through the haze. A dome, ancient, breathing. "That's where I end," she whispered. Min looked at her. "That's where we begin." And without another word, they descended into the ruins of something not built by humans, and not meant to be touched by anything with a soul. The entrance wasn't guarded because nothing living had ever made it this far. Min followed Lyra through a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, stepping into cold so deep it didn't just bite, it remembered. The inside of the chamber pulsed with a faint bluish glow. The walls weren't built, they were grown organic, metallic, alive in ways no earth material had ever been. The air vibrated with memory, as if every breath echoed through something ancient that never truly slept. In the center stood the core, a black monolith of smooth obsidian, covered in veins of soft light. The surface shifted slowly, like water remembering fire. Min stepped closer. "What is this place?" Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. "This is where they made me." She placed her palm on the surface. Instantly, the chamber brightened. Threads of light rippled outward, wrapping around them like strands of time unraveling. Min felt it then. Not pain, not fear. History. He saw her. Not as she was, but as she had been grown in a vat of light and steel, surrounded by sterile silence, her eyes open before her lungs ever filled with breath. He saw scientists, or what passed for them. Alien minds in glistening forms, watching, calculating, feeding her emotion like data points. Love was a test. Grief was a threshold. And Min had been a final trial. He staggered back. "You were made to feel love, just to report on it." Lyra turned to him, tears in her eyes, but no denial. "Yes, but I was never supposed to keep it." Min's voice cracked. "Then what are we, Lyra?" Something they didn't predict. She reached toward the monolith again. A panel opened, revealing a small crystalline node glowing like a heartbeat. "If I destroy this," she said, "I erase everything. The code, the tether, the line that runs from me to them." Min nodded. "Then let's do it." She didn't move. Her hand hovered, shaking. "It's not that simple." He frowned. She looked into his eyes and said it. "If I destroy it, I go with it." The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was recognition. The look on her face wasn't fear. It was peace wrapped in heartbreak. "I'm not just the key," she said. "I'm the lock." Min stepped forward. He grabbed her hand, fingers closing gently over hers. "Then we find another way." "There is no other way." "Then we make one." Her smile broke like dawn through clouds. Small. Honest. "You're so human," she whispered, "even now. And you're so much more than what they built." The monolith pulsed again brighter now. Warning. Time was running out. Somewhere far above, Min knew the relay was trying to reconnect. This was their window. Lyra leaned in, kissed him soft and slow. Not like goodbye. Like forgiveness. "When the light takes me," she said, "don't look back." He gripped her tighter. "If you go, I go." "No," she said. "You live. You remember." Her hand moved fast. One press. One breath. The crystal shattered. The chamber screamed. And then, light. So bright it erased thought, erased walls, erased time. And in that final moment, Min felt her hand and hiss until he didn't. When Min opened his eyes, the sky was no longer bleeding. It was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes before something terrible, but the kind that follows after. The canyon was still there, but the monolith wasn't. In its place, a circle of glass. Burned into the stone, smooth, perfect like something ancient had exhaled for the last time, and left behind a scar too elegant to be called ruin. Lyra was gone. No trace, no remains, not even her scent in the air. Just the feeling that something had been unmade, and in that unmaking, something had finally been set free. Min stood there for a long time, long enough for the wind to change. Long enough to believe it might have carried her last breath somewhere safer than here. He didn't cry, not because he didn't want to, But because grief like that doesn't come out in tears, it lives in the silence between heartbeats. In the way your fingers reach out at night for someone who isn't there, in the quiet guilt of surviving someone who gave up everything just to make sure you did. Eventually, he walked away. Step by step, past the wreckage, through the ash. He didn't look back. Not because he forgot, but because she'd asked him not to. And because behind him, the fire was still burning. Not in the sky, not in the canyon, but in him. In the end, she wasn't just a weapon. She wasn't just a lie. She was the choice they never accounted for. Built to infiltrate, programmed to betray, yet she chose love, chose pain, chose to burn herself away rather than become the thing they wanted her to be. And he didn't save her. He remembered her. Because sometimes the most human thing you can do is carry the fire someone else left behind. This was just one story in a galaxy full of secrets. And some of them are still waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe for more cinematic sci-fi tales of love, betrayal, war, and what it means to be more than what they built you to be. Alien Chronicles Stories from Beyond, where humanity is just the beginning.